It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a slow crack forming in a window pane. At first, I told myself I was overreacting. He always had bad days where even getting out of bed felt like climbing a mountain, but nothing had prepared me for what was coming. Fibromyalgia, they said, was chronic, lifelong. Severe pain, fatigue that clung to you like a wet blanket, moments when your own body felt like a traitor. 8 months ago, it escalated, and the reality of living with it hit me like a storm I couldn't escape. We had been together for 3 years, living together for 1, and I thought we knew each other well. I had imagined our life as a series of steady steps forward, the ordinary milestones everyone dreams about. A shared apartment, maybe a dog, eventually a home of our own. But all of that began to feel like a fragile illusion. When he woke up one morning, unable to lift his arm without wincing in pain, I realized this wasn't just a bad date, it was a permanent state of flux that would color everything. At first, I tried to compensate. I picked up more hours at work, made sure the apartment was spotless, cooked meals that would make his body feel a little better, a little less betrayed. I watched him struggle to function, even during simple tasks, and I felt a combination of pity and helplessness that twisted in my chest. It wasn't just his body that was failing. It was our life, inching toward collapse under the weight of a condition neither of us could control. Money became a constant, gnawing presence. His part-time job didn't last. He tried. I really admired him for it, but the body can only take so much when it refuses to cooperate. We relied mostly on my salary, and even though I earned well, the bills mounted like a relentless tide. Utilities, rent, groceries, the small luxuries we had once enjoyed, all of it vanished into a black hole of necessity. The cost of living crisis wasn't just a headline anymore. It was our kitchen table conversation, our fridge, our cupboards, empty and mocking. I remember one evening sitting on the couch, staring at a can of baked beans. Not just any beans, cheap store-brand beans, pale, watery, lacking the comfort of the ones I used to eat as a child. And in that moment, I realized something uncomfortable. I resented him. Not entirely, not wholly, but a tiny spark of anger ignited as I thought, I worked hard for this, and this is what we have now. It was terrifying to admit, because love, real love, isn't supposed to come with a tally sheet with an asterisk next to every hardship. And yet, there it was, festering quietly in the corners of my mind. Our apartment, which had once felt like a shared dream, now felt like a cage. Every small task became a negotiation. I found myself calculating every expense, weighing every meal, every trip to the store, every tiny indulgence against the inevitable what-ifs. What if I got sick? What if something unexpected happened? The weight of responsibility was exhausting. I was young, only 24, but suddenly carrying decades of worry on, shoulders that weren't built for it. I tried to remind myself of the good times, the laughter, the love, the shared dreams that had once seemed invincible. But those memories were becoming tainted by the pressure of reality. I watched his frustration at his own limitations, the guilt that weighed him down, and the helplessness that seeped into my own life. It wasn't that I didn't care, I cared too much, but caring alone couldn't pay the rent or keep food on the table. It couldn't erase the gnawing fear that our future was slipping through our fingers. I thought about the sacrifices I had made to get here. Years of studying, the relentless grind of entry-level jobs, the late nights and early mornings, all culminating in a salary that should have been a ticket to freedom, but instead felt like a leash. I was doing overtime, burning through my own energy to prop up a life that seemed increasingly unsustainable. And the cruelest irony, I had done everything right, yet I was drowning. Every conversation began to feel like a negotiation. Every decision a compromise between love and practicality. I loved him, I truly did, but love alone wasn't enough. The world outside our apartment didn't pause for chronic illness, didn't bend to accommodate fatigue and pain. And neither could I. The realization that I might be living a life of poverty, that the dreams of a home, a family, even something as simple as name-brand baked beans was slipping away, was terrifying. I started to question myself in ways I never imagined. Was it selfish to consider leaving? Was it betrayal to want a life that was mine, unburdened? My mind raced with possibilities, breaking the lease at the end of the month, moving back in with my parents, rebuilding my savings, reclaiming the small pleasures I had sacrificed. But then I thought of him, my partner, my love, my friend, then the impossible reality that he didn't have the same safety net. Couch surfing, relying on friends, living without the stability we had fought for it, was too much to bear just to imagine. And yet, the cracks continued to spread. Every day brought a new challenge, a new confrontation with the limitations of both his body and our finances. I felt like I was trapped in a delicate balancing act, teetering between love and survival, between compassion and self-preservation, and I couldn't see a clear path forward. The apartment, once a symbol of our shared independence, had become a pressure cooker of unmet needs, unspoken resentments, and a future that looked increasingly bleak sometimes. Late at night, I would lie awake staring at the ceiling, listening to his breathing, wondering how we had ended up here. I remembered the early days, when life was simpler, when our biggest worry was what movie to watch on a Friday night. Now, every moment was tainted by anxiety, by calculation, by the relentless grind of a life that seemed to be slipping through our fingers. I loved him, yes, but love didn't pay the bills. It didn't soothe the pain. It didn't fill the gap where security and stability used to live. I started to dream of escape in small, quiet ways. A weekend at my parents' house, a chance to breathe, to eat without calculating every cent. Even something as trivial as a proper meal felt like a luxury I was no longer allowed. And the more I dreamed, the guilt grew heavier. Was I allowed to think of myself, to want more, to consider leaving when love was all that tethered me here? The cracks in our life, in our relationship, were no longer small. They were fractures, jagged and growing, and I was beginning to fear that if we didn't address them, we would collapse entirely, leaving nothing but resentment and regret in our wake. The pressure didn't just sit quietly in the corners of our apartment. Anymore, it seeped into everything we did. Every conversation was loaded, every glance weighed with unspoken questions. How long could this continue? How long could I sacrifice without completely eroding myself? I started noticing the little cracks in my own patience, the way I snapped over minor things, the way resentment bubbled beneath the surface, unbidden and unwelcome. It wasn't like I hadn't tried to be understanding. I had rearranged my entire life around his condition. I cooked meals that were easy on his body, timed errands so that he wouldn't overexert himself, even made compromises in my own social life to accommodate his fatigue. But empathy, it turns out, has a limit. The more I tried to keep us afloat, the more I realized that the financial and emotional weight was dragging me down, and I resented myself for noticing it, for letting practicality seep into what was supposed to be pure love. I remember one evening distinctly. I had stayed late at work, finishing a project that demanded every ounce of focus I had. By the time I walked through the door, my body ached from sitting in the same chair for 12 hours. But I had hoped for a sense of relief, maybe a shared dinner, a small moment of connection. Instead, he was lying on the couch, wincing as he tried to reach for the remote. I realized then that our lives had become parallel struggles, running alongside each other but never quite meeting. I tried to talk to him, to articulate the fear gnawing at me, but the words felt inadequate. How do you explain that you love someone yet feel suffocated by their illness? That the very thing that makes you care for them also limits your own happiness? I stumbled over sentences, searching for a balance between compassion and honesty, and in the end, the conversation dissolved into silence. Silence that echoed with everything we weren't saying. Financially, we were unraveling. Savings, once a comforting buffer, were gone. Every month felt like a negotiation with the universe, every bill a test of endurance. I started thinking in numbers constantly. Rent, groceries, utilities, medical costs. I even began tallying small indulgences, like a chocolate bar or a latte, with guilt that felt heavier than the item's cost. My salary, though respectable, was being swallowed whole, leaving no room for the life I had envisioned for myself. And then there was the subtle, creeping jealousy of normalcy. I watched my friends post about vacations, buying homes, starting families, and even the mundane joys of dining out without fear of financial ruin. I felt left behind, trapped in a version of adulthood I hadn't anticipated, one defined by scarcity, stress, and compromise. The love I felt for him was real, but it was entwined with a frustration I couldn't shake. A quiet anger at the circumstances we hadn't chosen but were forced to endure. I began to question my own identity in ways that scared me. Who was I if not the provider, the one keeping us afloat? Was my love contingent on my ability to sustain us, or was it supposed to be unconditional? And if love could feel this heavy, was it still love at all? I knew these thoughts were dangerous, potentially damaging, yet I couldn't silence them. They whispered at me during quiet moments, in the shower, in the dark, in the split seconds before sleep claimed me. Every day, I felt like I was balancing on a knife's edge. One wrong move, one missed calculation, and the life we had built could crumble. And yet, leaving wasn't simple. My heart was tethered to him in ways that defied logic, and the thought of abandoning him to an uncertain future filled me with guilt so intense it left me breathless. I imagined him couch surfing, relying on friends, struggling to maintain dignity in a world that didn't slow down for chronic pain. The mental image was like a punch to the gut, and I hated myself for even entertaining the possibility of leaving. Sleep offered no escape. Nights were long and restless, my mind racing with plans, fears, and fantasies of a life unburdened. Sometimes I imagined walking out the door, keys in hand, leaving behind the apartment, the bills, the constant stress. I pictured myself back at my parents' house, safe, nourished, financially secure, able to rebuild what had been eroded. It sounded selfish, almost cruel, but it also sounded like survival. And that word, survival, lingered in my thoughts like a forbidden mantra, repeating itself every time I considered my future. We had discussed moving to a cheaper area, a compromise that might ease the financial strain, but the logistics were insurmountable. Moving costs, security deposits, the disruption of our small circle of family and friends, it all piled up, creating another obstacle I couldn't overcome. And selfishly, I didn't want to leave my support network. They were my lifeline, the only thing that kept me sane amid the chaos of illness and financial strain. I began noticing the subtle signs of my own emotional erosion. I snapped at him over minor inconveniences, felt irritation flare when he couldn't contribute to chores or expenses, and experienced guilt so sharp I felt physically ill. I had to remind myself constantly that it wasn't his fault, that the illness wasn't a choice. Yet, human as I was, I found myself resenting the situation itself, the way it had hijacked our lives, the way it had stolen the simplicity I had once taken for granted. Love and practicality collided in ways I never anticipated. I loved him deeply, undeniably, but love alone couldn't solve the practical realities of bills, rent, and a future that seemed to shrink with every passing month. I began journaling my thoughts in quiet desperation, hoping to untangle the mess of feelings and obligations, to find a path that honored both my heart and my mind. But the more I wrote, the more I realized there was no easy solution. Every choice seemed like a compromise. Every compromise felt like a betrayal, either of my own needs or of his. Resentment became a ghost that haunted even our moments of intimacy. Simple joys, like sharing a meal or watching a movie, were tinged with the bitterness of calculated survival. I started counting calories not for health, but for cost. I started skipping small pleasures, not for necessity, but for guilt. And in the quiet of the night, when I lay awake listening to his shallow, painful breaths, I asked myself over and over, how much love is enough when survival itself is at stake? I reached a breaking point in a moment so ordinary it almost went unnoticed. We were sitting on the couch, the muted hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. I had cooked dinner, a simple, cheap meal, but the fatigue on his face mirrored the exhaustion in my own soul. And in that stillness, I realized I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't continue sacrificing my dreams, my energy, my future, for a life that felt increasingly impossible. And yet leaving him would be devastating, morally complex, and heartbreakingly final. I knew then that I had to make a choice. Stay and continue down a path of financial and emotional depletion, or leave and reclaim the life I had worked so hard to build. There were no perfect options, only survival and love in tension, each demanding more than I felt capable of giving. The weight of responsibility, of love, of practical reality, pressed down on me until I felt I could barely breathe. I imagined breaking our lease at the end of the month, the prospect of packing up and moving back in with my parents. I saw myself reclaiming the financial security I had once taken for granted, rebuilding my life from a foundation that hadn't been shattered by illness and struggle. But the image of him, left behind, struggling to find stability, haunted me. I couldn't ignore the moral and emotional consequences, yet the thought of staying felt like a slow death of self, and so I floated in the tension, suspended between love and necessity, haunted by the knowledge that whatever decision I made, someone, either him or me, would suffer. Nights stretched into weeks, weeks into months, and the burden of indecision became almost unbearable. I knew deep down that the path forward would demand clarity, courage, and honesty, but I wasn't sure I had any of those left. The day I finally faced the decision, I woke up with a heaviness that made even breathing feel like a chore. I had spent weeks, months, wrestling with the what-ifs and the moral calculus of love versus survival. My heart wanted to stay. My mind screamed to leave. And in that quiet dawn, staring at the ceiling of our apartment, I realized that love alone couldn't sustain a life devoid of security, opportunity, and peace of mind. I walked through the apartment, observing the small traces of our shared life, his favorite mug on the counter, the stack of books we had collected together, the photo frames lined up on the shelf. Each item was a testament to a love I had cherished, yet each also felt like a chain, a reminder of everything that had tethered me to a life I could no longer fully inhabit. I knew that leaving wouldn't erase the love. It would just shift its form. But the practical realities, the unpaid bills, the looming uncertainty, the constant strain were impossible to ignore. I tried to picture him finding his footing without me, couch surfing with friends, navigating the complexity of an illness that allowed no pause, relying on kindness and goodwill instead of steady income. My chest tightened at the thought. Part of me ached to step back in, to hold him, to reassure him that it would be okay. But another part of me, the part that had been suppressed under years of compromise and care, whispered urgently, "You deserve a chance at your own life." We had talked vaguely about moving to a cheaper area, a temporary compromise that might ease our financial burden, but even that seemed impossible now. There were no funds for moving expenses, no safety net to catch either of us if it failed. And selfishly, I didn't want to leave my family and friends behind, only constants in my life that had remained, untarnished by the stress and struggle we endured. The thought of abandoning them for a distant, uncertain future felt unbearable. I made my decision not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. I couldn't continue to sacrifice my future, my health, my emotional stability for a life that was eroding me from the inside. I drafted a plan: break the lease at the end of the month, move back with my parents, start saving again, reclaim the small joys I had given up. Meals I didn't have to calculate, nights I didn't spend worrying, moments I could spend breathing instead of strategizing. It was a lifeline thrown to myself, a way to survive without abandoning my sense of self entirely. The hardest part was telling him. I struggled with the words, rehearsing and discarding them, knowing that no phrasing could soften the blow entirely. When I finally spoke, my voice trembled with the weight of love, guilt, and resolve. I explained that I loved him deeply, but that I couldn't continue in a life that was destroying my sense of self and my future. I offered what help I could advise: support in finding temporary accommodation, financial guidance, but I couldn't offer the impossible: the restoration of a life we no longer had the means to sustain together. His reaction was a mirror of the struggle we had shared for months. Pain, confusion, fear, and sadness crossed his features in a rapid succession. There was no anger, no accusation, only the raw recognition that reality had made a choice for us. We sat in silence for a long while, letting the enormity of the moment settle, acknowledging the love we had shared, and the love that would remain even as our paths diverged. Leaving him wasn't easy. Packing my belongings, walking out the door, feeling the apartment recede behind MIT was a quiet heartbreak that no words could capture. Yet, with each step, I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and liberation. I was reclaiming the life I had worked so hard to build, even if it meant leaving a part of my heart behind. The transition was jarring, but necessary. Back at my parents' house, I could finally breathe again. I had space, security, and the ability to rebuild my savings. Meals were a pleasure, not a calculation. Nights were peaceful, not sleepless with worry. And yet, the image of him lingered in my mind, the reminder that love sometimes demands sacrifice, even when it cannot be sustained. I kept in touch, in ways that felt manageable, offering support without enabling dependence. I encouraged him to seek out community resources, to connect with friends who could provide temporary accommodation, to advocate for the care and support his condition required. It was an awkward balance, remaining compassionate while protecting myself, maintaining love without returning to the exhaustion that had driven me away. Over time, I began to understand that leaving was not betrayal. It was an act of self-preservation, a recognition that love, no matter how strong, cannot replace the practical needs of life. We were only 24, not bound by marriage, not tethered by obligation. My decision honored both of us, allowing him to seek alternative stability and allowing me to reclaim the life I had worked so hard to achieve. I also began to forgive myself for the resentment, the fleeting anger, the thoughts of escape that had haunted me in the darkest hours. They were not signs of failure, they were evidence of my humanity, of the impossible weight I had carried silently for too long. Loving someone does not mean sacrificing yourself entirely, and surviving does not mean you are unworthy of love. In reflection, I realized that the years I spent with him were not wasted. They were formative, deep, and real. I learned empathy, patience, and the fragility of human life. I learned that love can exist in many forms, and that sometimes the most loving act is knowing when to step back. And most importantly, I learned that my future, my happiness, and my well-being matter as much as anyone else's even. Someone I love deeply. Walking away was not an end, it was a transformation. It was the acknowledgement that life is full of impossible choices, that love is not always enough, and that survival sometimes requires courage that feels unbearable. I still care for him, and I always will. But I no longer let that care consume me, dictate my future, or compromise my chance at a life I can live fully. I am beginning again, learning that freedom and love are not mutually exclusive, and that sometimes the heart must make room for both compassion for others and compassion for oneself. And in that balance, I am discovering that even after heartbreak and impossible choices, life can still hold beauty, opportunity, and hope.